Hello all, Alison here. Welcome back to Words and Pictures for another episode of Books. This is more of a storytelling episode this week, or also an insight into, I don't know, how the creative stories emerge as I'm working. So this double page spread you saw in the large Dilutions journal as I was flicking through that. If you haven't seen that flip through, I'll put the link in the description below. But I wanted to take a sort of closer look at this one because there are stories to be uncovered, hidden in the detail of this page. And as I tell you them, maybe I can just share a little bit about how it happens. I often say when I'm sharing my work on Instagram, how the paper dolls or the photo booth photos have been talking to me or have been telling me stories. And so, yeah, just a little insight into what that might be. You may be picking up some of the story already. So this one started with this photo booth photo, which already had that name handwritten onto it, Gretchen. Gretchen here is a young woman who studied at university. She was one of the early cohorts of women who actually were allowed to graduate. For years at places like Cambridge and Oxford, there were no women at all. Decades, in fact centuries. Then the women were allowed to come and work and study, but they weren't allowed to actually have a degree. Finally, they were actually allowed to graduate and call themselves BAs and MAs and so on and so forth. So she was one of the early cohorts that actually were allowed a degree at the end of their studies. And during her time there, you can see here she is with two friends she made on that science course. They were young women, the three young women on the science course, laughed at, mocked by the men, Smith, Puff and Laub, Gretchen Laub, that's her. And yeah, they were thrilled to be part of this early cohort. They didn't mind the mockery of the men. Shine like the whole universe is yours. That was the advice. They were studying chemistry and botany, as you can see. And this detailed work in the lab, experimenting, holding on to the dream of being able to graduate, of being able to call oneself a scientist. But unfortunately, the impossible is often the untried, and Gretchen wasn't having any of that. She decided she was going to try. And digging around in the library, she found many old tomes and books that were full of medicinal prescriptions and information. And you can actually see in the background there, that little bit of text stamping in the centre is from Culpeper's Herbal from 1659, which is a background stamp in one of my botanical stamps for Paper Artsy. That little violet there in the centre, and this little bunch of violets here. I'll put the details of this stamp set in the description. They are from my Violet edition. And she discovered these old books full of old recipes and remedies and potions, and she was spellbound by the idea of what these plants could do. And I'm afraid she began to dabble in slightly darker experiments than were really fully allowed on her scientific course. And you can see she's measuring things out, the half teaspoonful, little apothecary labels and so on and so forth she starts to use, and then sending off, writing letters around the world to renowned experts in the uses of plants in medicine. But then she was starting to experiment with some slightly less medicinal uses, so that word spellbound really does have a double meaning in it. She was enchanted by the detail, the possibilities, the medicinal properties of plants, but she also began to be interested in spells and potions and dabbling. Her cohorts, Smith and Paff, didn't want any part of this, and Gretchen went off the trodden path of science into the paths of mysticism and spells and lotions and potions. So I shall leave you to decide what it is that maybe became of Gretchen Laub, but those are the stories that came up to me, and it's pure chance that I happened upon this photo booth photo the same day that I pulled out the Smith, Puff and Laub from one of the Tim Holtz ephemera packs. The backdrop paper there, beautiful purple flowers, just seemed ideal to go along with my little violets, which I hand coloured. I've forgotten now whether I watercoloured them or maybe I used the distress pencils on them, I think. And gradually, as I was just grabbing bits of ephemera, it was all telling the same story. There's one of the Tim Holtz transparencies there, the violets behind Gretchen, and of course a little bit of crackle in the background of that page. And then it all just emerged on the page in front of me, which is very often how the creative process works for me, especially when I'm collaging, especially when I'm using ephemera. I suddenly find that everything I'm picking up feeds into the story in some way, shape or form. And it's not really planned, it's not really done in advance. It's the creative process emerging onto the page. So I hope that's given you some insight both into the story of Gretchen Laub and also into what happens when I start to play with some art journal collaging. Thanks so much for stopping by today, and I hope to see you again soon here at Words and Pictures, either for Books, or one of the other many series that you can enjoy here on the channel. Thanks so much for dropping in. Do leave a thumbs up, a comment or a question if you've got one, and if you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, I'd love it if you do that too. Take care and happy crafting all.